Look at your hand. Now look at the fork you probably use today. You used it to eat. You used it without thinking. You used it because it is normal. Because everyone uses a fork. Because that is how you eat. But imagine if I told you that this simple piece of metal, this thing with four little prongs, was once considered a tool of the devil himself. Imagine if I told you that using a fork made you a servant of Satan, that eating with a fork was a sin, that you would burn in hell for it. Sounds ridiculous, right? But for 300 years, that was the official position of the Christian church. The fork was not just strange, it was evil, and people were terrified of it. They were terrified of a piece of cutlery. They were terrified of eating in a way that we now consider completely normal. That is the strange, absurd, almost unbelievable history of the fork, and it tells us something deeply uncomfortable about ourselves. Let me take you back to the beginning. The fork is not a modern invention. It is not European either. The earliest known forks were used in ancient Persia, in what is now Iran, thousands of years ago. They had them in ancient Rome too, but only for cooking, not for eating. They used big forks to take meat out of boiling pots. They used them as tools, not as cutlery. But the fork as a personal eating tool first became popular in the Byzantine Empire. That is the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, now Istanbul. And in Byzantium, people used forks. They used them to eat delicacies like candied fruits and honeyed pastries, foods that were too sticky to eat with your hands. And no one thought it was evil. No one thought it was a sin. It was just practical. It was just convenient. And then the fork traveled west, and that is when the trouble started. The first person to bring a fork to Western Europe was a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropulina. She was born in Constantinople around the year 1000. She belonged to one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the empire. And in 1004, she traveled to Venice to marry a powerful Italian nobleman, Giovanni Orseolo. It was a grand wedding, a union of empires, and she brought with her all the luxuries of the East: fine silks, exquisite perfumes, precious jewels, and a little collection of golden forks. She used them at her wedding feast. She ate with them. She did not use her fingers. And everyone around her was horrified. Imagine the scene: a beautiful Byzantine princess, dressed in silk, sitting at the table of Venetian nobles. She picks up a golden fork. She spears a piece of food. She brings it to her mouth, cleanly, elegantly, without touching the food with her fingers. And the Venetians stare. They whisper. They are shocked. They are appalled. Because they do not eat like that. They eat with their hands. Everyone eats with their hands. That is the normal way. That is the proper way. What she is doing is strange. It is unnatural. It is the way of a foreigner. And they judge her for it. They call her pretentious. They call her weird. They say she is trying to be better than everyone else. And then something even worse happens. The princess gets sick. She falls ill, a plague, and within a year she is dead. She was just a young woman, and the church sees an opportunity. A few years after her death, a pious monk named Pietro Damiani wrote about her. He was a respected church leader, a theologian, a man of power, and he described the princess with disgust. He said her obsession with cleanliness and foreign customs was arrogant. He said her use of the fork was an insult. And then he made the fatal claim. He said her death was divine punishment. God struck her down because of her vanity, because she dared to eat differently, because she used a tool instead of accepting the hands God had given her. And that was it. That was the birth of the curse. From that moment on, the fork was tainted. It was not just foreign and strange. It was sinful. It was evil. It was the tool of the devil. But why? Why would the church hate something as simple as a fork? The answer tells us everything about the world they lived in. In medieval Europe, the body was seen as sacred and sinful at the same time. It was sacred because God made it. It was sinful because it was flesh. And eating was a complicated act. Eating was both necessary and dangerous. It was the moment when the body took in the world. It was the moment when the earthly entered the heavenly vessel. And the church had very strict ideas about how that should happen. First, God gave you hands. He gave you fingers. He gave you the ability to touch and hold food. That was part of His design. He created you this way. To use anything else, to insert a man-made tool between you and God's gift, was to say that God's design was not good enough. It was to say that His hands were flawed, that He made a mistake. And that was heresy. Second, the fork was seen as unnatural. It was not found in nature. It was a human invention. And anything unnatural was suspicious. Anything human-made was suspect. The devil was the great deceiver. He created tricks. He created false paths. He created tools that led people away from God. And the fork looked like a devil's invention. It looked like a tiny pitchfork. It had prongs. It pierced food like the devil pierced souls. It was a perfect symbol of evil. It was not just a tool. It was a weapon against God. And third, and this is the most telling reason, the fork challenged the church's control. The church controlled everything. It controlled thought. It controlled behavior. It controlled how you lived and how you died. And something as small as a fork was a threat to that control. If you could choose how to eat, what else could you choose? If you could defy tradition on the table, what else could you defy? The fork was not just a piece of cutlery. It was a symbol of human arrogance. It was a symbol of choice. And the church could not allow that. So the fork was banned. Not officially, not in any written law, but culturally, socially, it was taboo. People who used forks were looked at with disgust. They were seen as pretentious, as foreigners, as sinners. And this fear lasted for centuries. For 300 years, Europeans ate almost everything with their fingers. They ate meat with their fingers. They ate soup with a spoon, but the bread was dipped with fingers. They ate vegetables with their fingers. They ate fish with their fingers. And this was not just a matter of habit. It was a matter of hygiene. But not the hygiene you think. In medieval Europe, cleanliness was not associated with health. It was associated with vanity and sin. The body was made of dirt. It was born of filth. And to wash too much, to obsess over cleanliness, was seen as pride. It was seen as trying to be better than God made you. So people did not wash their hands. They did not wash their faces. They did not wash their bodies. They ate with dirty hands. They smeared food across their faces. They wiped their hands on their clothes. They wiped their hands on the table. They wiped their hands on the dog. And no one cared. Because that was normal. That was the natural way of things. And anyone who tried to be cleaner, anyone who tried to be more refined, was seen as a sinner. They were seen as someone who thought they were better than everyone else. And that was the greatest sin of all, pride. So for 300 years, people suffered. They suffered from diseases that could have been prevented by simple cleanliness. They suffered from infections, from worms, from parasites that were spread by dirty hands. They died from food poisoning because they ate with fingers that had touched everything. They died from diarrhea, from cholera, from typhoid, and they called it the will of God. They believed that sickness was a test. They believed that suffering was good for the soul. And they never once thought that something as simple as a fork could have saved them. Not one priest told them to wash their hands. Not one bishop told them to use tools. They were too busy fighting against the fork to notice that they were drowning in filth. The fork was the enemy, not the dirt, not the disease, not the death. The fork, a piece of metal with 4 tiny prongs, that was the devil. Meanwhile, across the world, in China, in Japan, people were using chopsticks. They were eating with tools. They were eating cleanly. They were not dying of the same diseases. And they were not fighting with the devil. The devil was in Europe. The devil was in the church. The devil was in the minds of people who feared the very things that could have saved them. And then, slowly, things began to change. It took 300 years, but in the 16th century, the fork began to reappear in Europe. It came back through Italy, which had never fully abandoned the Byzantine tradition. It spread to France, where Catherine de' Medici, an Italian noblewoman, brought forks to the French court. It spread to England, where Queen Elizabeth herself was known to use a fork. But even then, it was slow. Even then, people resisted. They called the fork a toothpick of the devil. They said it was for the weak, the sick, the old. A real man eats with his hands. A real woman eats with her hands. Only the sickly, the vain, the foreign used forks. And this resistance was not just male. Women resisted too. They said the fork was unchaste. It was inappropriate. It was too intimate. It was a tool that entered the mouth, and that was somehow shameful. It was a moral battle. A battle fought on the table, and the fork was losing. But then, in the 18th century, everything changed. The Enlightenment happened. Science began to challenge religion. Reason began to challenge tradition. People began to question the church. They began to question everything, and one of the things they questioned was the fork. Why was it evil? Why was it sinful? There was no reason. There was no logic. It was just superstition. It was just fear. And they discarded that fear. They embraced the fork. They embraced cleanliness. They embraced refinement. The fork became fashionable. It became a symbol of status and education. It became a symbol of class. If you ate with a fork, you were rich. You were cultured. You were civilized. If you ate with your hands, you were poor. You were a peasant. You were a savage. And the church, which had fought so hard against the fork, was forced to accept it. They had no choice. The world had moved on. The world had left them behind, and they were left with their fear. They were left with their silly, irrational, murderous fear. A fear that had kept humanity dirty and diseased for 3 centuries. A fear that had killed millions. All because of a fork. Now, let's step back. Let's think about what this story really tells us. It tells us about the power of belief. It tells us about the power of fear. It tells us how an institution that claimed to protect people from evil actually made them suffer more. It tells us how progress is always resisted by those who have power. The church did not hate the fork because it was actually evil. They hated it because it was new, because it was foreign, because it was a challenge to their authority. And this pattern repeats itself again and again. Every new invention, every new idea, every new way of doing things is met with fear. People call it unnatural. People call it dangerous. People call it the work of the devil. And then, eventually, people accept it. And they forget they ever fought against it. They forget they ever feared it. And they call it progress. This is the story of the fork, but it is also the story of everything. The internet, electricity, the telephone, the airplane, vaccines. Every single one of these things was called unnatural. Every single one was called dangerous. Every single one was met with fear. And every single one eventually became normal. Because fear is not a guide. It is a prison. And those who live in fear never progress. Those who fear the new never grow. Those who fear the fork never eat cleanly. So the next time you sit down to eat, the next time you pick up a fork, remember this story. Remember the princess who died. Remember the church that condemned her. Remember the millions who suffered from dirty hands. Remember the absurdity of it all. And then realize that you are holding a tool that was once considered the instrument of the devil. And you are using it casually, without fear, without thought. You have accepted progress. You have moved past the fear. But there are still things you fear. There are still things you call unnatural. There are still things you call dangerous. And maybe, just maybe, those things are as harmless as a fork. Maybe the devil is not in the tool. Maybe the devil is in the fear. And maybe the only way to defeat it is to pick up the fork, to try the new, to embrace the strange, to trust that the world moves forward, not backward, that progress is not a sin, it is a gift. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. I know this was a strange story, a story about a piece of cutlery that was once called the devil. But I hope it made you think. I hope it made you see the world a little differently. And if you enjoyed it, if you want to hear more stories about the strange, unexpected histories of ordinary things, consider subscribing. It helps us keep making videos like this. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Do you think we still fear things for no reason? Do you think the church was wrong? Do you think we are still making the same mistakes? I want to hear your thoughts. And remember, the next time someone tells you something is unnatural, think of the fork. Think of the 300 years. Think of the princess. And ask yourself, is this really the devil? Or is it just something new? Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and eat with whatever tool you like, even if it is the fork of Satan.